Welcome to Philosophy and Critical Thinking, the basics. In our last video, we discussed conjunctions, disjunctions, and contradictions. In this video, we're going to be discussing advanced arguments. Let's look at this argument here. We need a change in government. To change government, we need to vote for the other party. Therefore, we need to vote for the other party. So, with this argument here, someone could challenge or be skeptical about this conclusion by being skeptical about the first premise: we need a change in government. So, in order to be able to get someone to be convinced of this premise, just like with any other argument, we would need to provide a sound argument for this premise. So let's take a look at that. So here's an argument for that premise. The current government is doing a bad job. Second premise, changing government is what is needed when the current government does a bad job. Therefore, we need a change in government. Now, we now have here an argument for one of the premises and an argument which is an argument for another overall conclusion, which is that we need to vote for the other party. Let's see how we can put this together to make one whole argument. So let's see how we can put this all together. We can have the original argument, which is we need a change in government. To change government, we need to vote for the other party. Therefore, we need to vote for the other party. But prior to that, we can put the argument in standard form for that first premise, which is premise 1, the current government is doing a bad job. Premise 2, changing government is what is needed when the current government does a bad job. Therefore, conclusion 3, we need a change in government. Conclusion 3 is also premise 3, because that's the premise for the overall conclusion number 5, we need to vote for the other party. So this is how we can put multiple arguments together, which all together operate for an overall conclusion. So if every premise that someone's going to doubt or reject will require a sound argument in order for the premise to be justified, there's a problem in philosophy called infinite regress. Infinite regress is that if it's true that every premise requires a sound argument, every premise that is in that argument will also require a sound argument, and every premise in that argument will also require a sound argument, and that will go on and on forever. So the problem is where do we stop? Where are we going to stop our infinite regress, or can we stop the infinite regress? Because if we can't, then it's going to raise the question of whether we can get knowledge about anything, because any top place we want to stop the infinite regress will seem arbitrary, or we'll say, well, we can't know that, and since we can't know that premise, we can't know that conclusion, we can't know the next conclusion, and then it'll ultimately end up that we can't know anything. So there's some special ways some people will go about trying to stop the infinite regress problem. The first one is just to apply some circular reasoning, which we discussed in the previous video. But with the circular reasoning, we're just asserting the premise as a matter of fact, saying, well, it's true because it is true, or it's the case because it's the case, which some people will do. The problem, as we raised in previous videos regarding circular reasoning, is that that doesn't give us knowledge of the conclusion, or in this case, the premise for the conclusion. So that's the problem there. The second one, very close to this, is to appeal to common sense, to say, well, it's just a matter of common sense. Everybody knows that. The problem with appealing to common sense is there's been things in the past that seemed like it was common sense, but after further evidence or someone giving a compelling argument, the thing that seemed to be common sense turned out to be false. A perfect example of this is there was a time when everyone thought that the sun revolved around the earth, instead of the Earth revolving around the sun. That seemed to be common sense, because you'd look up and it seemed like the sun was moving around us, and with further evidence and science showing us that's the opposite. So there's an issue with appealing to common sense. Regarding the topic of common sense, in the description of this video, I'm going to recommend a book called An Introduction to Philosophical Methods. In this book, they go over some of the philosophical arguments for the use of common sense, which are quite interesting, and we'll be covering that in more depth in later videos. But if you want to get a good idea of certain circumstances where people will advocate for the use of common sense in arguments, I recommend that there. Another approach can be weakening the conclusion. So normally with that conclusion, we're talking about where something definitely is the case, where we could weaken the conclusion to say, instead of saying something has to be the case, we can say it's probably the case. And we could weaken it even further and say it's possibly the case. An objection can be here is that if you do that, you no longer know what you're trying to claim. This is like, if you say something's probably or possibly the case, you're inferring that that we don't know this, and we're trying to get knowledge out of the argument. And to say probably or possibly, we're no longer getting knowledge out of the argument. That said, if we're going to get rid of probabilities and possibilities, then it leaves us with very little to talk about. And as normal interactions in our day-to-day lives, we deal with probabilities quite a bit. So I don't think that's always a great argument, but it's something to take into consideration if you're going to weaken the conclusion to try to avoid the the infinite regress problem. Another problem we can have with applying probabilities to a conclusion is something in philosophy called the problem of induction. Now, this problem of induction is a popular problem in philosophy, and it will require its own video and its own tutorial to go over in more depth. But typically, the problem of induction is appealing to what we've experienced in the past to make an argument about what will happen in the future or what will happen in the present. Take, for instance, the classical argument that we started with, the all humans will eventually die. If someone were to challenge that premise, say, well, how do we know that? How do we know that all humans will eventually die? Our argument could be, well, up until this point, every human that has ever lived has eventually died, so all humans will eventually die. As we think about that, we can tell very quickly that that's going to be an invalid argument, because just because something had always happened in the past doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen in the present or the future. A good example would be, say, a friend of yours has gone to work for 363 days of the year. For you to say, well, that means he's going to be here on the 364th day of the year, is an invalid argument, because someone could quickly say, just because they've been at work every single day of the year doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be there on the next day. They could, decide just, that had a good year of work, they're going to take a day off and enjoy themselves or something like that. So since we know it's invalid, you'd have to weaken the conclusion to make it probable. Now, when we go into the problem of induction more deeply, there are some objections to even claim probability, but typically most people will accept that probability is okay. So what we have here is all humans have eventually died until now. And the next premise, if all humans have eventually died until now, then all humans that exist right now will probably eventually die. Then to the third premise, I am a human that exists right now, therefore I will probably eventually die. So now we can make the argument sound. So the problem here can be is that when we're applying the probability, it's not normally what our reactions are about this conclusion. If I said to you, I'll probably eventually die, most people's reaction would be, not probably, Andrew. It's going to happen. This is definitely going to happen. So just weakening the conclusions all the time can sometimes be a bit of a problem. Some people are happy with that. They'll throw away the idea of certainty and just work with probabilities, and that will be something to consider when we distinguish philosophy, current philosophy, with science. With science having a claim of probabilities and only with probabilities, or like in many aspects of science. But this is just a problem just to be aware of if you want to try and weaken the conclusion. Another problem in philosophy which can come about is called the problem of scepticism, or the problem of knowledge. And some can even put doubt into what we know based on our observations. Like in the previous one concerning the problem of induction, where we're taking as a given that what we're observing is what we're actually observing. Some will doubt even what we are observing is the case. Take, for instance, the premise, I'm a human that exists right now. Someone could raise the possibility that I'm not a human that exists right now. I could be a robot that has been given this illusion of being a human that exists right now. I could be something like a robot in the Matrix per se, like that movie The Matrix, where everyone was in a simulated world. I could be in that simulated world, but not as a human being, as a robot or an alien or so on and so forth. And there wouldn't be anything based on our observations that could refute that, because someone could quickly say every observation we're having, everything we feel, everything we touch, everything we hear, everything we see, and so on, is all a part of this simulation. So anything we could use to try and challenge that could be explained away. Since we can't rule it out, it remains as a possibility, giving us room for doubt. What this originally came from was a philosopher, Rene Descartes, and he's popular for that quote that many of you will hear when people talk about philosophers: "I think, therefore I am." In Latin, it's appealed to as "cogito ergo sum." What this is about is where Rene Descartes did put forward, when it came to knowledge, where we could have a full stop claim, something we know that is true, and it doesn't require any further sound argument to establish it as true. So the "I think, therefore I am" is the argument that if you're thinking, you know that you exist. But that's all you can say. So that's all you can say here from the "I think, therefore I am," is that if you're thinking, you must be existing as some kind of thing that thinks. You could be in the Matrix. You could be like to use Rene Descartes' specific example, is there could be an evil demon out there which is deceiving you with, making everything that you think you're observing about yourself and about the world is completely wrong, and it's just playing tricks on you all the time. But you could be some weird kind of substance, some kind of gas in the world which has a capacity to think. But any example you're going to think up, it's going to have you as some kind of thing that thinks. So it means "I think, therefore I am" is saying that if you're thinking, and you know that you're thinking, you can't think of it. If you're thinking, you can't, almost by definition, think of any circumstance, because the fact that you're thinking about a circumstance of where you're not thinking, you are already thinking. So you know you're thinking, and you know you have to be existing as some kind of thing that thinks. So that is when people refer to "I think, therefore I am." That's what they're referring to. The problem that can arise with this, though, is that that doesn't give us very much. Okay, we know that I'm thinking as some existing thing. We need much more than that. We want to know that what's going on in the world is actually going on in the world, and we want to make other arguments about different things, and so we need much more than that. Rene Descartes does put forward his own arguments for that, but those arguments would require, once again, another video dedicated to itself. But it's good to know that that's where a possible stopping point is, but that stopping point isn't very helpful, given that we want to talk about lots of other issues where that stopping point doesn't get us there. So a solution I tend to use regarding our practical use of sound arguments is that with both parties, we should be giving them a sound argument, and also a sound argument for each premise which may be in dispute, until we get to a point where the premises used in the argument are uncontroversial to both parties. So, or both, when I say both parties, it could be individual one-on-one, or you could assume that the premises are uncontroversial for the audience or whoever you're engaging in the argument for, or so that's the standard I tend to set. So it's very similar to the common sense standard. And obviously, since it's similar to the common sense standard, it does inherit its issues. It might be uncontroversial to everyone, but someone might come up with a great argument or show some new evidence to show that we're all mistaken about that premise. So it's not perfect. But for our practical purposes, like when we give an argument, we're normally giving an argument because it's involving a conclusion which is in dispute. So the standard I like to set is that we'll rely on uncontroversial premises, or at least we'll give arguments for premises that are controversial until we get to the point where we're relying on uncontroversial premises to give a sound argument for a controversial conclusion. So that's the standard I like to set. Granted, it isn't perfect regarding our theoretical issues of ultimate knowledge, but I find this is where a reasonable standard is set in order to avoid the infinite regress problem. If you want more information, you can go onto the website www.philosophycriticalthinking.com and try out the test questions there on what you've just recently learnt. We can also, if you click on the description, you can purchase the book Understanding Arguments by Walter Sinnott Armstrong and Robert Fogelin. Also, in the description, you can purchase the book An Introduction to Philosophical Methods by Chris Daly. In regarding the common sense issues we talked about today, if you want to go into a bit more depth there, you can get it in that book by Chris Daly. In our next video, we're going to be discussing, instead of appealing to an argument, like analysing an argument, we're looking at the person who gives the argument and the times when that's appropriate and inappropriate, called appealing to authority and ad hominems. So if you want to see that video, or you want to see more videos, please subscribe and click the bell. Thanks.